and then you're surprised. They say, oh, I don't really like this kind of music. And like, I thought I knew you very well. And of course, they'll be back again, all keeping you in stitches and giggles, driving you to work every weekday, except Friday, when Ngoni and Skata are doing their thing. It's the Champions League breakfast. Tinashe Ngoni. Chucks was also on there. And Patisani every weekday, 6 all the way until 9. We're right here on the crunch at 9 all the way until midday. And of course, you and I love to have hearty discussions as you are getting about your mid-morning discussion. It is a Tuesday today, and what we love about Tuesday, we start off spending some time talking, reading, and getting to understand our literature. Now, you know, Folake, I have been harping on about, the importance of May from Africa Month, but also a very important theme that we're walking around, and that was Zimbabwe Culture Month. One of the key themes was looking at how we can celebrate indigenous voices. Now, for me, the idea of indigenous voices became more than, recognizing our different dialects and languages that are out there, but also how to make them mainstream. Let me give you a very interesting story. On my way to work this morning, I was with someone and I was giving them a lift, and they were trying to explain how they'd been in somebody's car and they started sneezing. And I sat there and I was like, that does not sound right. At the same time, I could not give the correct Singwi for how to express how hot it is in Shona. And it had me thinking about how you and I have gotten better sometimes, more articulate in every other language but our own indigenous language. And to that spirit, I'm quite excited this morning. We have a very powerful panel, if I can put it that way, as we're talking about literature. And it may be a challenge for you to correctly articulate yourself in Shona, in Nambia, in Venda, in Dao. And albeit I haven't come across any other indigenously written book that's not in Shona or Ndebele, but it would be very interesting what it would be like holding a novel, a thriller, investigative story written in Nambia. Can you picture that, and what the expressions of Nyaudzo Singwi would be in that discussion? Now, interestingly, when we are talking about celebrating indigenous languages, Muswe Friday, if you remember, we went on to ask a very simple question. If you were to explain the concept of, say, electricity in Shona, in Chindao, Chindere, Nambia, how successful would that be? And further to that discussion, we have a very exciting panel this morning to help us understand how, in the spirit of celebrating Zimbabwe Culture Month, Africa Month, and the themes, how do we reconcile, support, and reclaim, and possibly even develop our African indigenous languages, particularly in our storytelling? But the development of our languages, particularly in some of the subjects that I've already listed to you. When you think about raising your children, are you raising them with a sense of pride about speaking indigenous languages to help them develop a healthy sense of identity? Or is it enough for us to just say, Chirundi? So I've spoken enough, 3 minutes worth already. I want to excitedly introduce the voices that are joining this discussion, as they are people who have spent time understanding language in itself. Let me start off by going all the way to Kenya. We are meeting a professor who teaches literature. He has, interest in researching indigenous languages and how we can use language in diverse contexts. And also, at the moment, he is now teaching, is lecturing at the University of Machakos in Kenya in the Department of Linguistics and Languages. So excited to have you this morning, Professor Ladin Divo. And it's like, 10:30 in Kenya right now? Good morning. Larry, Prof, can you hear us?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Yes, good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you hosting me.
Mm-hmm. And also in studio, a queen of the motherland from Zimbabwe, Dr. Professor Hurumbwi Mangoshongwe. She's also the chairperson of National Languages Advisory Board and Zimbabwe Media Commission chairperson, joining us in this discussion. Prof, good morning, and thank you so much also for coming into studio.
Good morning, Folake. Thank you so much for hosting us for such an interesting topic and a very pertinent and critical subject matter.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Prof, I'm going to start with you in studio, and then we're going to go to Dr. Larry in Kenya. Development of language. Firstly, how does language develop?
Language does not develop in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. That's the first important point. And language does not develop in a lab. Language develops within a community of people who use that particular language consciously with the idea of connecting with one another, sharing values, sharing wisdom, sharing ethics, sharing the heritage that is embedded in that particular language, which is part of the definition of our language, really, of our identity rather, not language per se. So as we are looking at developing language, we are looking at how best we can sharpen our intellect using the very language as a tool that enhances, understanding within the community, within the entity, within the institution, and hence even the idea of sharing a vision, sharing ideas, and sharing and entrenching the very essence of what we want to become and how we relate amongst ourselves, with our environment, and the broader or larger world. So in language, if I may quickly also add, we have the embodiment of the philosophy of life, how we see and understand the world, how we see and understand ourselves. This is captured or encapsulated in the language that we use. So as we embrace the use of certain languages or shun the use of certain languages, in essence, we are actually giving priority to the very language, that we are using, or we are demeaning the stature and the position that the very language we are shunning actually occupies in our lives. I would like to zero in on the celebration of Culture Month, last month in May, that we went to Chirezi as a country. We congregated in Chirezi to celebrate, officially, to have the official, launch of the celebration in Chirezi in a community that uses a specific, language, local language, indigenous language. How was that relevant? The idea is for us to recognize the importance of each one of those 16 languages recognized and affirmed in the Constitution. Not only that, but other languages as well. How important they are, not just in, keeping people connected to one another, not just to keeping people, participating in local programs, but actually in identifying with the soil, on which and in which they live and, get sustenance from. Because language also is not an abstract. It's not an abstract term. Whatever is embedded in language has some origins in the journey that we have traveled, in the history, the landmarks, the milestones that the very people who use that language have achieved or have attained. Not only that, even the aspirations, what they actually want to become, is embodied in the very language. This is how critical or how important our local languages are. Unbeknown to us, unwittingly, we shun them. And as we shun them, we are actually shunning who we are. We are shunning the very histories, that our forebears, have traveled to where we are. We are also shunning even the very struggle that brought us the independence that we have today. Because we talk about Wanawevu. What does it mean? Let me hasten to say how thrilled, I was with Minister Mona at the official opening by His Excellency the President, 2 weeks ago, the opening of Trabablas interchange. Vamona vakataura neshona, hapana kana mazwi ekukwereta neimwe mitauro yavakadini avaipotsera imomo. Wakanyatsotaura zvokuti nechaunga changa chiripo wachipedza kutaura dai makanzwa mhururu mipururu nemheterwa kunyatsopangidza kuti wanyatsondosvika pamwongo nepamwoyo yevanhu vanga vachidini vanga vachitaura navo panguva iyoyo.
Got you. Now, Dr. Larry, as you're listening in, Prof is also sliding into. Oh, we've just lost Dr. Larry there. All right, we're going to try to get a hold of Dr. Larry, but I was going to be very interested, as he's hearing you, Prof, sliding into Shona, one of our indigenous languages. How for him in Kenya is he able to follow the discussion? And I was curious to hear from him, from his understanding and his research, how did we as Africans communicate before colonization came, that became a tool to separate us? Was it as easy for us to communicate? But also, we want to discuss the power of us prioritizing our indigenous languages as the mode of instruction. We're going to... Dr. Larry, good morning. Can you hear us?
Good morning.
Yes, sorry, we got disconnected there. I think it's network. And I was saying, Prof slid into Shona there, which is, one of our indigenous languages officially recognized. And I couldn't help but wonder, when she slid into Shona, how much of that you were able to understand, one. And I got even more curious that before we were colonized and separated, before we became Kenya and Zimbabwe, how would Africans in this part of the world be able to communicate with someone in Kenya, for example?
Definitely listening to Prof,
Yeah.
a couple of things that kept my mind.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain sections when it comes to the language which talk to us in now, then for communication first and foremost. And so we need to ask ourselves what are those ideas that people express between themselves? What are those emotions that we use to connect with one another?
Right. And
basically, I want to imagine that in our primeval times, before we got colonized, there must have been certain means through which we could talk to one another. It doesn't matter whether we had specific words which we could relate with one another. It could just basically be some gestures. It could be gestures. It could be certain symbols that we would use to get across one another.
Right.
So there must definitely be a kind of means through which we'll be able to relay information from one person or from one community to the other.
Wow, got you. And so for you in Kenya, how important is it for us to, see indigenous languages becoming perhaps even a main mode of instruction? For example, in school, there's been lots of research that suggests that once you have, teaching of something like physical science, in English, for example, it actually has more challenges than it would for us learning in the languages that we are more proficient in. In this context, it might be Shona, it might be Ndebele, it might be Venda, it might be Chindau, it might be Mati Prof.
Gikuyu.
It might be Gikuyu in Kenya. Yeah, Prof.
Business is the Kikamba. It belongs to the Bantus.
Right.
It's related to Shona.
Okay.
Kikamba. So let's get some few things here.
Right.
First and foremost.
Right.
You making a question that relates to cognition. How we are able to probably visualize, how we are able to conceptualize. And that's why you are saying that it makes a lot of sense if, first and foremost, the first language that a child gets socialized into, that is the one that we need to pay attention to, the indigenous language.
Right.
And why that is important is because this is the initial contact that the child has with the world. And so, because the culture of the community, because everything about the people around the child all the things that the child observes right from the time of birth. Remember, this is the time that they're beginning to register things at the back of their mind. So if we are able to pick on that language that the child gets socialized into first and foremost when you come into this world, I guarantee you that when you introduce anything else to them much later in life, they would have it a lot easier in terms of understanding, in terms of becoming knowledgeable. But when we introduce the foreign languages at an early stage in the life of the child, we end up confusing them.
Wow.
Because we begin now making translations. We start telling the child, if, for example, we're talking about a basin that they use to maybe wash clothes, I would rather we go off the word that is in the indigenous language, because then it will be easier for them to connect. But when you begin making translations, you lose them. You begin confusing them.
Right.
I don't know whether it makes sense.
Yes, yes, it does. So for Kenya, I understand that the official languages are Kiswahili and English, and I think it's actually in your constitution that says the state shall promote and protect the diversity of language of the people of Kenya and promote the development and the use of indigenous languages, including, and I found this fascinating, Kenyan Sign Language. So help us understand, Doc, from where you are standing as Kenya, how have you made Kiswahili an official language outside just being able to communicate in it, but in terms of the power of storytelling, in terms of teaching subjects like physical science? Network has gotten dodgy there. 0719 100 404. As you're listening in, we've been trying to really have an honest conversation about the power of learning in our indigenous languages and how, truthfully, that could speak to perhaps even embedding our identity. On Friday, if you remember, there became a discussion on how one of the reasons why Africa may not be creating, innovating, albeit I say inventing as much, is because we're not learning and teaching in our indigenous languages. So as Prof was explaining, you're having to translate your knowledge into what you know rather than organically thinking in your indigenous languages. What's your feeling about that? The use of our mother tongue in education and public life. Prof, as we're trying to connect with Dr. Larry there, I've just remembered, or you could speak in was English. That had to be the form of communication we had. That was the only way we were allowed to communicate. In Zimbabwe.
It's an experience that happens not just to you. Even as I was also growing up in the late 1960s, early 1970s in primary school, you'd wear a badge, if we heard, at school talking in Shona. Wopuwa chikwangwani chakanze Shona speak. And you'd feel so embarrassed. Utunopedza, the whole day while chikwangwani chakanze Shona speaker, and actually being punished, for talking, in your local language, in your mother tongue. And in the process, what that did was to dislocate us, and to shift us, force us from the local space, intellectual, to a space of colonization. Intellectually, takutoti susano chirungu ndizvo, and till today, and we also used to have radio lessons in English, where we'd have somebody read, some passages for us in English. The whole school, the radio would move from one class to the next. Each school each class slot the model, English. And you would have to repeat, even words, pronunciation, and so on, concepts, and the very tone, that the speaker on radio. We used to have them as English radio lessons. So in the process, what that does is to prioritize the importance of English. And I remember in Shotangisa kundo teacher pa Queen Elizabeth School. Sekuru wangu ashinditi unofanira kuteerere mangezi. Wari pedro na Mwari. Saka, that kind of mentality. Yekuti we actually disown ourselves. We disown our own languages. Ndozvatishitsa even parinas.
Yeah.
Zvoti ukanyatsoona vana vedu havachagoni kutaura the local languages wakawanda. And it's an embarrassment for the parents kuti afeila chirungu or afeila French or with German, whichever other foreign language they are being taught in my schools.
Right.
As when they fail the local language, so that it's a 10% or 15%, they
We're
laugh
not
it off.
embarrassed. This is fascinating.
No, it's fascinating. They laugh it off. I don't go no chichi,
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I actually ran into some parents in at some shopping mall, with a girl, a young lady, O level. I greeted that young lady in Shona. She couldn't respond. And then the father is a chemistry teacher at some high school. And then he told me that no, she cannot, speak in Shona. She doesn't understand.
Wow.
And I asked her how that young lady would relate with her grandparents and other, peers of her age outside their home, outside their suburban, life and so on. She said, oh no, they'll have to tolerate and
Wow.
appreciate her. That's who she is. This is from the parents. So what kind of legacy, are we passing on? And then, if I may make reference to Ngugi there, why it is important for us to be using our own indigenous languages. Jans, if you use a borrowed language, it's like somebody who harvests. Marima, harvester. These are the experiences that Dr. Larry was talking about. The first language and interact nayo ne world yangu is the mother language. Saka ndasensa mother language ndiri kukura ndobva ndanzi aiwa drop it takushandisa this language. What that does, zvanzi naNgugi, tiri kuharvesta zvatinenge takohwa takuisa mudura rekukwereta, because we are now prioritizing language yevauyi. And patinenge takuzoda kuzoshandisa language iyoyo, you won't be able to find it because you don't know what is happening to it there. In the meantime, we are developing other people's languages that we are not even conversant in, because language is essence culture, essence identity. Saka isu patinenge takubatira pamusoro, for instance, hatinzwisisi zvimwe zvinhu tiri kutora language as malabels atiri kushandisa, asi the essence yephilosophy behind those languages hatina kuibata. We are not schooled in it.
Got you. So
ndingangopa a quick example. Tikapinda in an office and at my previous school, you wouldn't immediately drag a chair and take a seat. No, you'd wait for the headmistress to offer you a seat, and then gara, because I've been offered a seat. That's the English tradition. You're walking into some people's space, it's cultural space, it's business space. You wait for the dictates of that environment to tell you how you should behave, isn't it?
Right.
Tasvika kuno kudare kwa mambo kana kuti mumba chaimo ndosvika ndoramba ndakamira. Takakura isu chinzo karamba wakamira unonzi enda kwamai nhengu undopuwe musipiti, meaning kuti you cannot stand kana wapinda mumba mune ma-elders kana mumba mune ma-adults, you have to immediately take a seat. So here we have our children now. Should they take a seat when they walk into that, or should they stand?
Wow.
So there is the confusion. We now have the confusion when we have those languages now.
This is very fascinating. And
having that kind of contact.
Yeah, at the very least, what I'm taking away from this discussion so far is language is not just for communication. It is connecting with your identity, with your culture. We've got Dr. Larry back online. Doc, when we lost you, and thank you so much, Prof, for that. That is very insightful, how we should actually understand the power of language beyond just communicating, what it does to our cultural considerations.
And to our intellect.
And to our intellect.
Yes.
Prof, before you got cut off, we were just saying, I've observed that in Kenya, Kiswahili and English are official languages, and your constitution actually says, the state shall promote and protect the diversity of language, of the people of Kenya and promote the development and the use of indigenous language. And Kenyan Sign Language is also listed there. I wanted to check with you, how exactly have you as Kenya managed to actually then promote the use, to protect, but also develop the use of indigenous languages? Again, I go back to the example of teaching physical sciences, for example. How have you as Kenya managed to do this using Kiswahili?
Okay.
Prof, can you hear us? No, it's not your fault. It's network all over. Did you catch the question, however?
That's the question.
Okay.
And I listened to Prof. Shona.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
the issue about the policy and the institutionalization of the language has worked, I would say, much better for English, but not necessarily for Kiswahili. So for Swahili, people tend to just do it for the classwork.
Right.
But then when it comes to its day-to-day use outside of the classroom, people have really struggled with that. So you would find that a majority of people who tell you that they don't find it easy speaking Swahili, and that's how we ended up having the street language sharing, corruption of English now and Kiswahili.
Right.
But coming back to the sign language, that I think is working a lot more for people professionally, because they have found there is a niche when it comes to the work environment. So a couple of people now are interested in the sign language just because it can bring some food to the table. But to take you back slightly to the issue about the indigenous languages, yes, it's in the constitution, and what the new system of education is trying to do now is to push and see whether the communities that are not so much urbanized can revisit that and begin probably training and teaching the children about their first languages. But that is probably not working out again very well, because a lot of the areas in Kenya have ended up being a little bit urbanized, I would say. And that urbanization is what is bringing a lot of complexities, because then people are saying, if I can take my child to probably a local town, then they cannot speak the first language because they might meet other children who probably don't share the same first language. That is also bringing a bit of complications. And you know what Prof was talking about when it comes to colonization, the erosion of indigenous prestige. So parents taking pride in the fact that their kids can speak better in English, they can probably speak eloquently in French or in German, and so on and so forth. So that has brought a sense of shame. And the fact that we take pride in those foreign languages has then ended up interfering with our sense of who we are in terms of identity, in terms of appreciating our culture, our cultural beliefs, our religious beliefs, and just generally the sense of identity. So we need to really have a serious conversation in terms of how we can go back into the first languages, the mother tongue. Because that's the one that brings in the pride. That's the one that brings in the need for me to want to learn about my history, to want to learn about my people, to want to learn about my ancestors. And that is what gives us a sense of identity. I want to imagine that is what Budu was saying. But if you go out and learn all the languages of the world, but you do not know who you are, then you are a lost person.
Wow.
If you do not know the languages of the world, but at least you understand your mother tongue and who you are, then you have actually become a somebody, you know.
Got you. So how do you think, and I'm also going to ask Prof. Ruby the same question, how do you think we can then make our African languages stand out globally? Because right now, Africa is inundated with Mandarin, with French, with German, with Italian, but I can't imagine going to China and them having the same pressure to learn to speak Kiguyu, Kiswahili, Chivenda, Chindau, Shona, Ndebele, and yet they're also coming into Africa. So how do we get our languages to stand out globally, Dr. Larry? Okay, we seem to have lost Dr. Larry there. But Prof, For you, how do we get our languages to stand out as Dr. Larry is coming back home?
Thank you so much, Folake, on that one. What I would like to urge and encourage in terms of embracing our languages, it's political will. It's political will. For instance, we used to have radio programs. Mbuyamlambo, remember the late Mbuyamlambo?
Yes.
How young children would look forward to those programs on radio. To Mbuyamlambo wachitaura, Ngano, and apart from Ngano, and also drop in one ethic or two, and wachizobvunza vana would repeat and so on. A very subtle way of inculcating wisdom, a subtle way of inculcating the values that bind and hold us together. That would how would mainstream our local languages in schools.
Right.
Beginning at a low level,
Right.
mainstreaming them, and then the idea of then growing up, using those languages. There's no shame anymore. There's no one who would look down on you, because the idea of actually being conversant in your language gives you a sense of dignity, a sense of pride.
So how do we connect that to our African theme? Because that's what it's talking about. It's talking about decolonizing who we've become as Africans,
Precisely.
right? So how do we do that? Because lots of people, even on this show, believe that as long as Shona and Ndebele is not going to take me to France, I don't care about Shona and Ndebele.
The question is, what is it that you are going to get in France? That's the question. And if you go to France, for instance, I've been to Germany. I've been to some other, countries. Try to talk to them in English. They'll completely ignore you. They'll ignore you completely. And I've had colleagues who have gone to study in Germany. The first 6 months of the program, they're learning nothing else but German, because they will not converse with you in your language that you're trying to impose on them. And we don't get it, in our own country. That the first thing that gives us an anchor in who we are, the pride that we should have as Zimbabweans, are the very languages that we are shunning. We try and adapt, for instance, to a foreigner who doesn't speak, our local languages. We try and, assist them and help them out and so on. But when we go to their countries, we have to learn their languages before we visit their countries, so that we'll be able to connect and communicate with them. So the whole idea of a low self-esteem and a low value that we attach to ourselves keeps suppressing us. And it's unfortunate that if you want, to keep slavery going, you have to, and we have to make a conscious effort ourselves to decolonize our minds.
I'm so sad we've got less than 2 minutes before we have to pause this discussion. But the good thing is,
let me quickly say, Paulo Freire was very clear, pedagogy of hope. He wrote about pedagogy of the oppressed and how we become, little things that can be manipulated in pedagogy of the oppressed and so on. But
so news is coming up next. Prof. Ruby, thank you.